Well, here we go again. Shelves are empty of toilet paper, again. Government officials are talking lockdowns, again. We're all dreading what happens next, again. And in the middle of all that is this ongoing collision of what has to happen to keep us safe in the midst of a pandemic versus the fundamental rights that are guaranteed us in the First Amendment. Hi, I'm Stuart Shepard, and you're watching First Liberty Live. And our guest today is Ann Bradley. She is a rare expert who can give us a clear perspective on this from both an economic and a biblical perspective. She's the George and Sally Mayer Fellow for Economic Education and the Academic Director at the Fund for American Studies, and we're grateful to have her here today. Hi, Ann.
Hi, Stuart. Thanks for having me.
It's good to have you. I should also mention you spoke at our fellowship gathering that we have at First Liberty for students around the country. We bring them into Washington, D.C. for a week and show them around, and you were gracious enough to come by and speak, and you really got their minds going. I was in the room while you spoke, and it was fun to watch.
Well, that's always very fun for me, and I can't wait till we can do it in person again.
Yeah, I hope the pandemic and the vaccines and all that come together in a way that allow all of us to start having a normal life again. That would be a good thing. Hey, in a white paper you wrote for us here at First Liberty, you explained that so many of the decisions that are being made are based on models of the future that attempt to predict if this, then that. A good example for our conversation would be if we close churches, then people will worship online. It's easy to say, but the reality gets way complicated real fast. Unpack that thought for us, that if this, then that kind of idea.
Absolutely. And so this is kind of the conflict, I guess, between economists and how we think about policy and scientists and how they think about the virus. And of course, in a pandemic, you need both of those groups of people working together, not in conflict, and of course, many more. And so I think it's just different points of view, but scientists approach their models in that very way. They're testing. If this happens, what is the outcome? And when we can do that in a laboratory, we can learn things, and that's very important. And so we can use those findings to certainly inform what we should do as we live through the COVID-19 pandemic. I think the problem with some of the scientific models that have been used and have been very influential for policymakers is that kind of we assume that people can be kind of robotically plugged into this algorithm or into this model. And we can say, like you mentioned, if we close churches, if we make people order their restaurant food to go and make them take it home, then they're going to be safer. Some of those assumptions perhaps might be true, but I think the problem is that each individual is unique, and each individual has different risk preferences and different risk tolerances, and that's not all bad all the time. The problem with living in a pandemic from an economic perspective, but of course this spills over into policy, is that this is kind of an externality problem. So for economists, what we mean by that is there's spillover costs. So what you do might affect me if I'm your neighbor, if I'm your aunt, or if I'm your cousin, right? And we don't have a good way to monitor how other people are behaving. And so this leaves a lot of uncertainty with what are my neighbors doing and should I trust people? And so I think lockdowns that say, churches are non-essential, we're just going to close them, it's a way to keep people safe, that only works if it does, in fact, keep people home, right? And church isn't the only place people go. So, then you kind of ask the question, well, what else do we need to lock down? And do lockdowns really stop the spread of the virus? And so I think the problem with some of these scientific models is they've assumed that we can just tell people what to do and that they're going to do it, and that that's going to be effective. And I think there's some real questions about that. And then, of course, as an economist, I would say we need to look at the costs of that. We can't just do benefit analysis and say, well, lockdowns make people safe. Even if that was true, there's a very high cost to our civil liberties that we have to be very thoughtful about.
And there's a thought there that you stated early on in your answer, and that's this, that the people who are expert at viruses and pandemics are leading the conversation here, because their first priority is how do we keep people safe in the face of this? And they have a sense, I think, it's not like they're blind to the idea that there are consequences to the choices we make, but that doesn't make them expert at applying restrictions and regulations to a nation full of people and predicting, as you just mentioned, how they're going to react to that. Unpack that a bit for us. How do we find that balance between people who are expert at disease and people who at least have some expertise in social economics?
Correct. Yeah, and we need that balance. And so I think there's a couple of things that we could talk about here. One is just what are the assumptions that are being made in the models? And so some of the most influential models that have been used to influence kind of the COVID-19 pandemic assume that lockdowns work. So, a scientific model, an economic model, they are only as good as the model creators, right? So they're only as good as the assumptions upon which they are founded. And so it's not clear to me that is a ubiquitous assumption we should make in our models, that lockdowns work. And if we can look across the world, there's lots of countries who have gone into lockdown. They've thought that they've had some success. New Zealand is an example. And then, as soon as the lockdown is lifted, you have this kind of out of control spiral. So the social economics that you mentioned is really important. And here's the fundamental point to me that I think scientists need to just have more conversations with economists and policymakers about, which is that human beings are social. We are social creatures. We are designed by God that way. We cannot flourish or thrive alone. And gosh, hasn't that become so apparent as we find ourselves in isolation? We're heading into the winter, going into more isolation, perhaps. We have a little reprieve. And so there's a lot of costs to that from just a human nature perspective. And so I think people fight those lockdowns because of that, because it's so antithetical to our nature. So, kind of balancing, how do we learn from science about how to stop the spread of the virus? And that's not really all we should care about. It's how to help people who get it become better. And I think that's what we're looking at right now with vaccines and with treatments and different types of drug protocols. We're going to have to live with this virus probably forever, just like we live with the common cold and like we live with the flu and we live with other viruses. So the key is medical intervention. I think what lockdowns focus on is just how do we stop it? And, at the beginning, it was about flattening the curve so we didn't overload hospitals. And you can understand that, right? The hospitals have a limited capacity. If everybody's rushing in and everybody needs a ventilator, then, we have a real capacity problem. And so I think we need lots of innovation. This is what I see as missing from the policy conversation that's being informed by scientists, or maybe overly informed by scientists, is that innovation is going to get us out of this. It's innovation in vaccines, innovations in hospital capacities, innovations in entrepreneurship and education. This is going to be how we live safely with the virus into the future.
There's a line in the white paper you wrote for us that fits right into this. You write that one elementary principle of economics is that, quote, people respond to incentives and we must treat them as unique individuals. And that's exactly what you were just talking about, right?
Exactly. Think about it this way. Your pastor or priest at your church does not want you to get the coronavirus. That person does not want to get the coronavirus. That person does not want to host an event that will lead to kind of super spreading of the virus. And so I think those incentives are really powerful. What we need to allow pastors to do, what we need to allow nonprofits and charities to do, because we still need those to function so deeply, we need that, was we need to allow them to innovate. We need to allow entrepreneurs, instead of saying you have to stay open and you have to stay closed, to rather say, let's get out of the way and let you figure out how to safely operate. And I think that, again, that's the solution. And people respond powerfully to the incentives of profit, right? So when we think about how firms can respond here, they don't want to go out of business. They also don't want to spread the virus. So the incentives in some ways are already naturally aligned for them to figure out really workable solutions.
One aspect of this that fascinates me, because I've been following policy for many, many years now, is, and it doesn't matter who the decision maker is, there are decision points all along the way in this kind of situation, and they're dealing with real-time data coming at them, and they're offered an array of choices to choose from, and they make decisions, and they have to, because that's what leadership does. You make choices in real time with what's in front of you. But then it becomes a sporting event for the media to say, well, you should have acted sooner or later, or you should have done more or less, or what you did really impacted this group of people worse than that group of people, et cetera, which ignores the fact that these aren't black and white decisions. There's not right and wrong. It's not a true false exam. It's just now or later, more or less, and trying to balance the impact either way. When you see those reports, what goes through your mind? How do you take those in?
There's a lot of things I could say here, but as they say, hindsight is always 20/20, right? And so this is the problem, is that you're absolutely right. And when we're making these decisions, policymakers and even scientists and economists, we always have limited information, and we don't know how things are going to change. I mean, imagine if we could have seen this coming in November. We would maybe not have had some of the same temporary shortages that we had. We would have been able to respond differently. This is life. This is the world. This is the reality of scarcity and limited knowledge. We just don't know. And we have to make decisions, as you say, in real time. And then we learn. And then what's, I think, key is to rethink our decisions in the light of learning. Policy tends to not be really great at that. I think entrepreneurs are better. Again, it's because they have different incentives to do so. The way the media kind of gets involved in this, though, I think is really important and can be quite damaging, which is to say, they play the I told you so game, you should have done this. And what we see with this virus, particularly in American politics, but I don't think it's just limited to the American political scene, is that this virus has become entirely politicized. And so, kind of there's these stereotypes where, if you're on the right, then, maybe that means you don't take it seriously, or you think we shouldn't have lockdowns and somehow you don't care about it. And if you're on the left, then, the stereotype is let's just lock down forever and write people government checks and everything will be fine. I think both of those stereotypes are unfair, and I think they're wrong. But what it does, the media's role in advocating and agitating those stereotypes, is that it pits neighbor against neighbor. Nobody has perfect information. I mean, I think most Americans sat through April and May and thought, what is the right thing for me to be doing right now? Right? I mean, because we find ourselves in a new situation. I mean, should I go to the grocery store? Should I do Instacart? What about people who can't do those things? So I think we're just muddling our way through. So what's the solution in all of this is to not be such harsh critics. I think the media, because they have hindsight, it's easy for them to criticize and amp up the politicization of the debate, which I think is a problem, because I don't think that gets us to a solution. I think it just gets us angry.
And the deep appeal of it as a reporter is it allows you to pretend that you're a genius looking backwards in time, when in reality, everybody has to look forward and decide what to do next. But they like sitting there like they're the most expert in the room, when in fact, they're just setting people up for the hard question. Hey, I wanted to share with the people who are watching, we've set up a special page on our website that's focused on this essential fight for our freedoms. On that page, you'll find a collection of resources about religious freedom in the age of COVID, including a downloadable version of the white paper that Ann wrote for us. You'll also hear, there's a video on there from Kelly Shackelford, and there are other videos that deal with this. It includes stories of cases that we've won for religious freedom during this crisis. And there's also, you can learn about our First Liberty Insider, which will keep you up to date week to week on what's happening around the country. When you're done watching this video, you just drop by firstliberty.org/essentialfight. And you can find all that. And we'll put that link in the text that goes along with this video as well. And economists often look at complex decisions through a cost-benefit analysis. Let's apply that idea, and you've talked about it a little bit already, through the real-life decisions in front of us. The government has somehow become expert in deciding what's essential and what's not. But underneath that is a cost-benefit analysis that relies on the prejudices of the person deciding. Explain what that means when it plays out in real life with decision-making.
Absolutely. I think this is where the rubber meets the road in terms of the long-term consequences of these policies. I think it's a dangerous thing to put in the hands of the state, determining what's essential and what's not, because only consumers, only you and I can decide that. And by the way, when we make those decisions, now we have kind of put entrepreneurs and workers and employees in those situations in a different type of position. So to call someone non-essential, What are you saying about the work that they do, that it's not meaningful, that it's not valuable, that we're just going to put you on hold for right now? And what does that say about the people that we do deem essential? Should they get raises? What does all of that mean? I think there's real danger in making those claims. It's easy to say, well, maybe the grocery store should be open because we all need food, but maybe the bar shouldn't because we don't need to be socializing in a restaurant. Maybe, right? But again, I think that innovation is what is going to allow people to live into their own risk profiles, right? And so if you're worried about even stepping foot in a grocery store, let's let grocery stores innovate to find out how to engage in contactless delivery for you. This, by the way, is much easier in cities and suburbs located near cities. It is far more difficult to make those types of transitions when you live in rural areas. And so I think when we just kind of make blanket policy statements, this is essential, this is not, we're really impacting the incomes and livelihoods of people. And I think this disproportionately affects in a negative way people who are less connected, who live in rural areas, people at the bottom of the income distribution. So this has inegalitarian outcomes. I want to say another thing about this too, which is that what economics teaches us is true all the time, is that there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. What that means is that there's no policy wand that we can wave that's going to make COVID go away, make everybody get their jobs back, go back to the fantastic and historically low unemployment levels we had in February. I mean, we were just in a really great spot. A lot of that has been destroyed, and we hope that it gets repaired. But there's only trade-offs. There's no magic in policy. The government doesn't have magical powers to just make bad things go away. So it's obviously a lot more nuanced and a lot more complicated than that. And that's what I hope we do. Not just, policymakers tend to focus on the benefits only of their suggestions. But economists say, no, we have to look at the costs. And so deeming somebody permanently unessential, maybe, I think, is damaging.
I recently spent our team did several weeks in California, visiting with churches and worship pastors and people who head up Christian schools and that sort of thing. And they were all in the midst of that fight where government was trying to say, well, worship is good, but you shouldn't be singing because we need to limit that. And you can only have so many people in the room. And your school, well, it's okay for kids to be in the room, but we can't really have anybody teaching them because for some reason that would be a problem. That's really a hard line. And particularly, it seems like there may be an underlying motive for these government officials that are placing unnecessary restrictions on churches that they aren't placing on, say, the big box store down the road or the liquor store up the street.
I agree. And again, you want to give policymakers the benefit of the doubt, but I think sometimes we have to look at the agenda. And so to me, there's a kind of this famous saying, never waste a crisis. And so policymakers are very attuned to that, to not wasting a crisis. And so, again, to say, well, maybe you can go to church, but, maybe not for a period of time, and maybe you shouldn't sing. And this is all, first of all, predicated on questionable science, right? So science is always in motion. It's always about critiquing the status quo and learning. Science is never settled. That's the first kind of thing. So when policymakers will just say, no singing ever, okay, maybe, but probably not, right? Let's kind of do more studies and research that. I think that's one area that we need to be cautious of. But I just think there's an agenda perhaps behind this to take more control over religious institutions, which would allow the U.S. government to perhaps transition from, religious freedom to religious tolerance. We're going to tolerate what you do, but you're not ultimately free to do it. Because again, that changes the role of the state and the church, right? Rather than being the guardian of our liberties, they're just going to say, we're going to tolerate this until we don't. So I think that there's some very frightening agendas around personal liberty and religious liberty that we need to be very cautious of in a crisis. And I think, again, in a crisis, some people are more willing to give up those liberties because they assume they'll just get them right back later. But history is not on the side of that argument. That once you lose those liberties, it becomes harder to get them back.
So as we wrap up here, I'm going to declare you queen of the world, at least for a moment.
Yay.
Yeah, the crown's in the mail. But if you held the decision-making power, what would be a better way forward to get us from where we are back to normal life again? What would you say the proper steps would be?
I think sometimes, again, because there's no policy magic and we don't know as we head into the winter, who knows what's going to happen. So I think the best thing that policy can do is in many cases remove themselves as an obstacle. So we've seen some of that and it's been encouraging. We've seen the rolling back of certain types of regulations, the acceleration of vaccines. And, the FDA has just such a lethargic and bureaucratic approval process. It takes years and years and billions of dollars to bring life-saving drugs and medical devices to market. Let's make that go away. And we've seen some of that, right? We've seen kind of the rolling back of certain types of HIPAA regulations that allow telehealth to happen. We've seen that entrepreneurs having relaxed regulations to allow them, especially restaurants, to engage in to-go and curbside. So this is a relaxing of kind of food regulations and safety regulations. It's not that we don't want people to be safe, but again, the economist question is safety at what cost? And so I think just letting businesses find creative solutions, I think advising on new science, just saying, hey, this is out there, right? We're going to have to socially distance for a long time, I think. So that's, I think, where we need innovation. Let's get kids back in school and find creative ways for them to learn while they're 6 feet apart. It can be done. I mean, my kids are in private school and I can tell you it can be done. But you have to have the incentives and you have to have the political will. And so that's what I think policy can do is, yes, listen to scientists, but also listen to economists and get out of the way and let people figure it out.
Perfect. Ann Bradley, thank you for sharing your insights with us. Very helpful.
Thank you for having me. It's always fun to do this.
That's good. I really appreciate your insights. I learned stuff today, which is always a good sign. Hey, if this conversation resonates with you, you'll definitely want to visit our Essential Fight webpage. It's at firstliberty.org/essential fight. It's important information we wanted to make readily accessible to you. There's a collection of videos that deal with our religious freedom during the pandemic, including some of the video we shot in California recently, talking to people there who are on the front lines of this, the faces, cases, and places that are happening there. You can read about the cases First Liberty has been winning to protect our freedoms. You can learn more about our First Liberty Insider, which will keep you up to date on what's happening around the country. And there's a downloadable white paper that Dr. Bradley wrote for us on this topic that goes into greater detail. It's a good read. I can recommend it. Just drop by firstliberty.org/essential fight. And just a final thank you to those of you who are watching this. We appreciate your being interested in these issues. And if they resonate with you, we invite you to support the work we do here at First Liberty. We can make sure that the things you want done out there are getting done. Just go to firstliberty.org and you can support us there. And thanks again.
Thank you, Stuart.